In this section, this last section, I'm going to talk about taking those basic building blocks and putting them together to build new kinds of models. So you should really think about the building blocks as a kind of modular toolkit. And it's hard to go through many different variations on different compositions of these building blocks. I'm going to just focus on one kind of combination in the context of motion perception. So to motivate this, the question is, how do we parse a moving scene? An interesting observation about motion, the aspect of motion that I'm going to focus on here, is this idea that when we look at a moving scene, we naturally extract a kind of hierarchical structure from the scene. And I'll illustrate what I mean by that by this little clip. So when we watch a movie like this, there are a number of things that we see. So we can perceive the motion of Dr. Octopus and Spider-Man relative to the background, and within that reference frame, we can also perceive the relative motion of Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus relative to each other, and we can also perceive the motion of Dr. Octopus's tentacles relative to his body. And so what we have here is a kind of hierarchically organized collection of nested reference frames. And this kind of nesting of reference frames is actually has been studied for many decades, and probably the seminal contribution to that research was Gunnar Johansson's PhD thesis, which was published in 1950 as the book Configurations in Event Perception. And what Johansson did was he showed that you can get remarkably complex percepts using just simple dot configurations. I'll show you a few examples. So let's consider this dot. Everyone can see that that's moving diagonally, right? Okay. So what Johansson did was, yes, what happens if I add two dots that are always collinear with this diagonally translating dot, and these two dots are going to be oscillating horizontally. So now, I think for most people, I've shared it so many times it's hard to say, but that most people will observe that this dot is no longer perceived as moving diagonally, but rather it's moving up and down within this horizontally translating reference frame. Another classic example, which actually predated Johansson, is known as the Dunker wheel. So imagine the way they actually did these experiments originally is they took a wheel and they put a little light on the rim of the wheel, and they turned all the lights off in the room, and they rolled this wheel, and then they showed it to naive observers and asked them what they saw. And when you do that, you don't see rolling motion. What you actually see is what's called cycloidal motion, this sort of bouncing thing like that. But if you then add another light at the hub at the center of the wheel, then all of a sudden that same motion is perceived as rotation, rotating around this horizontally translating reference. So these are two examples of cases where our percept of a particular motion can change radically depending on the reference frame that we create for it. And Johansson, in addition to laying some of the empirical groundwork for these ideas, also laid the theoretical groundwork. In particular, he had this idea of vector analysis, that what you do when you see these dot configurations is that you basically extract the common motion of the configuration, and then analyze as well as the relative motions. And so what you're actually perceiving is the motion, the relative motion that with the common motion subtracted. So, for example, in this in the first dot configuration that I showed you, you're going to take this vector analysis would take this pattern that's the observed motion vectors, and decompose it into the sum of this horizontally translating motion plus this vertical motion that's specific for this middle. The problem, though, is that many different vector interpretations are available for a given motion pattern. So how do we choose which one? And over the years, various principles have been proposed. The minimum principle, that simple motions are preferred, an adjacency principle that you should assign dots to the nearest reference frame. But no real coherent theory was proposed that could integrate all of these different principles. We, that is Josh and Frank Gakel and I, tried to develop such a theory. And our starting point was actually this theory of Bayesian motion perception that was developed by Yair Weiss and Ted Adelson, that they called the slow and smooth theory. And the reason they called it slow and smooth theory is because the idea is that you combine the likelihood here is just the motion energy that's coming into your visual system, computed in early stages of your visual system, with a prior that favors motions that are both slow and also smooth over space. But this is a sort of flat theory of motion perception. It doesn't do any kind of segmentation or nested reference. So we sought to generalize this idea in what we call Bayesian vector analysis, and the centerpiece of this idea is what we call a motion tree, which is a decomposition of the moving scene into a hierarchical set of nested reference frames. So the idea is that each one of these nodes here corresponds to a motion component, which is basically a vector field, and that the sum of a particular object in the image, the observed motion of a particular object in the image is the sum of motions along this path. So Spider-Man's hand here, the observed motion for Spider-Man's hand, is decomposed into the sum of the motion of Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus relative to the background, plus Spider-Man's relative motion, plus the hand motion relative to Spider-Man. And so the way that this model extracts the motion tree is using Bayes rules. So now we have the probability of this motion tree given a sequence of images is proportional to the probability of the images given to the tree, and the probability of a tree. So this is the point where we're going to start combining the different building blocks that I mentioned to you before to get these different pieces of the model. So we assume that the tree structure is drawn from a nested CRP. So remember, the nested CRP is a probability distribution of these trees that can be potentially infinitely deep and infinitely wide. So this allows the model to adaptively select how many motion components there should be to analyze a particular image. And then each node in that tree is associated with a vector field that's drawn from a Gaussian process. And the Gaussian process basically imposes something like the smoothness constraint that was in the Weiss and Adelson theory. And then finally, one nice thing about using Gaussian processes is that the sum of Gaussian processes is another Gaussian process, and that means that you can take the tree structure and analytically marginalize out all of the component motions to compute the marginal likelihood of the actual observed motion. So that allows us to use this to basically just compute this posterior probability over trees given images, while not dealing directly with rather marginalizing out the component motions. Okay. So this is what happens when you apply the theory to these kinds of stimuli. So here's the Johansen stimulus. The percept you see is this nested motion percept of vertical motion that's nested within horizontal motion. And when the model extracts is something that looks like this. So the motion tree is actually quite simple. It has the root node of the tree is this horizontal motion, and then you have this vertical motion here, and you see that the bottom and top nodes get assigned to this root node, and then or rather they get assigned to a path that starts and terminates with the root node, whereas the middle dot gets assigned to a path that goes from the root node to to the child. Dunkerwill is the same kind of story. So if you just see the motion on the rim, you see basically cycloidal motion, but when you add the center motion, then it extracts this rotational motion that's nested within a horizontally translating reference. Okay, and then this model can capture a bunch of other things we don't have time to go into, but this is just an illustration of the ways in which you can take these different building blocks, in this case Gaussian processes and nested Chinese restaurant processes, and combine them in ways that make sense.
By the way,
yes.
This is interesting also because Ederson price model is basically completely equivalent to regularization.
Yeah.
And but your three base model is more complex.
Yeah.
So you couldn't wait to.
Yeah, but interestingly, you know, it's interesting to think about the balance between fit and complexity in this kind of model, because what the model is basically doing is it's trying to, like, what is simplicity in this context? Well, the simplest thing would just be a single node, right? But the model will prefer nesting motions to have more shared structure across motions rather than building a large number of clusters, right? So when you think about the motion tree, well, you know, there are different things that could happen, right? It could try to make the tree deeper, or it could try to make the tree wider, and the model will prefer making the tree deeper because there's actually it's difficult to explain without going into the math, but there's the description length of this model is shorter when you have more sharing components in this hierarchy. Okay, so the last part I'm going to talk. Oh, yeah.
So, like you're motivating this by saying you want kind of a unifying theory for all these kind of principles.
Yeah.
And so could you just talk like you kind of talked a little bit about it right there, but like what exactly does the prior prefer? It seems like all the work is being done, all the work is being done by the prior, or a lot of the work is being done by the prior, right? In terms of like giving you a theory. And so like it prefers to nest things. Is there anything else that you can?
Well, there's going to be, in this model, there's going to be a dominance of local information compared to distant. So there's a proximity sensitivity here. Things that, so this is equivalent basically to Gogel's adjacency principle that, or it's one version of that. Objects are going to be differentially sensitive to reference frames that are nearby rather than farther away. And the idea of
are reference frames constrained to be spatially contiguous?
They don't have to be spatially contiguous. I mean, I should say that there are lots of ways that this model is sort of incomplete. Like, for example, it doesn't really deal properly with certain kinds of motions that we know obey physical constraints in the world, like articulated motion, right? So in the case of biological motion, this is not the same as contiguity. It's actually in some sense, it's a stronger constraint because we know that the physical structure of the body skeleton imposes articulation on motion, so things can only move around joints, right? But the model doesn't know anything about the skeleton. We just show it here for illustration purposes. It just knows about the coherent changes of different points on the skeleton. But yeah, there's no contiguity constraint. You could build something like that in, but that's actually a little dangerous, right? Because of things like occlusion, right? So if part of my body, my body is being occluded here, right? But you're not gonna all of a sudden think that I lost half my body or something like that. Yeah. So okay. So does that answer your question, Alex? Okay. So now I'm going to just talk briefly about automatic structure discovery, and I think Josh will talk a little bit more about some of these things. Okay, so we have a kind of set of building blocks for structure. Right now, we're more or less picking the right structure by hand, and we do this automatically. Charles Kemp, a number of years ago, had developed the idea that you could devise essentially a graph grammar that would build up a very large family of different structures through a small set of production rules, and then the idea is that if I give the model a particular data set, then it will use these production rules it will try to recover the set of productions that gave rise to those data. So it's trying to analyze the structural form of a data set into a small number of objects like partitions, chains, orders, rings, hierarchy, etc. So it's some examples, like if you feed the model information about animals, like the features of animals, then it can recover something that looks like a taxonomic tree. Or you feed it faces, it recovers some kind of planar face space. You give it Supreme Court judges, voting patterns of Supreme Court judges, and you get a linear space. Color gives you a circle. Space, you get like a map-like structure. And so these are in all these cases, these are the structural forms that best explain the data. More recently, Roger Gross pursued a sort of related line of reasoning where he was trying to unify a bunch of different probabilistic models that were based on matrix factorization, and the idea was to construct a grammar that could be composed in potentially very complex ways, and the grammar had production rules like low rank approximation, clustering, linear dynamics, and so on. And when you set it up like this, it can actually produce many of the models that are in wide use today, and show how they're all interconnected. So it can show how things like low rank approximations are connected to low rank linear dynamical systems or sparse coding and so on. And importantly, so you can apply it to a data set, and it will figure out the right combination of these different production rules to model that particular data set. They're basically doing a kind of greedy search over the marginal likelihood. Even more interesting, I think, is the follow-up work to that, which is like, how far can we actually go with this? Can we actually basically replace scientists with computers by, all right, so I can have my automatic structure discovery algorithm, which I give it some data, it finds structure, and then I write a paper about it. But maybe I don't even have to write the paper. And that's actually exactly what they did. So they defined a family. In this case, they were using Gaussian processes, but this general idea is not unique to Gaussian processes, where they defined a large number of different kinds of kernels and ways to combine them. And then what they did was they used Bayesian model selection to pick the right set of kernels, and then they had propositional descriptions of those kernels that they could basically use to synthesize a quantitative description of a data set. So in this case, you give it, this was, what data set was, this was I think it was solar something or other.
I can talk about it.
Oh yeah, okay, are you going to talk about it? Yeah, anyway, so, but I highly recommend you go, you go look at these they've created a bunch of these automatically generated papers, and it actually reads like a paper, but it was sort of poorly written paper. But it's actually quite remarkable. Okay, so just to sum up, the motivation for non-parametric Bayesian models is to facilitate the process of structured learning in a way that balances that allows for sort of arbitrary complexity, but also preference for simplicity, so you can kind of get just right structure. And I talked about some growing experimental literature in cognitive science that supports the idea that some of these things might actually be going on in the brain, and that you can take the basic building blocks like clusters, features, and functions and compose them in new and interesting ways. Okay, and if you're interested, you can. There are a few papers that I've written, some other people have written that summarize this and also go into more of the mathematical. All right, thank you. You can take questions, or if there are no questions. And I'll be around for the rest of the day, so feel free to find me, and I'd be happy. I'd like to meet as many of you guys as I can.
After doing the aviation put that pocket with here. Yeah.
Okay, good. So we're probably we have to. I'm gonna some of the things I'm going to talk about. I mean, it's very related to what Sam talked about, and just very complimentary, almost. Where is it? Okay. We probably won't. I don't know if we'll. I mean, I can always expand any time allotted to me, unfortunately, but I don't know if we'll use the whole time. I guess we have until. Tell me how much we have till 3:30 officially, or how long is this session?
Well, we have usually until 4.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll see how it goes. We might end a little bit early, or maybe Tomer, depending. Tomer's still getting all his notes and tape, so you might want to do the first part of the more lecture part of your tutorial or the break, and come back to the. I don't know. We'll see. I'll go for somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll see how it goes. We could also have some time for discussion and sort of general questions on everything you've seen this morning. And another thing, if we have extra time, is, somebody asked a question about how the kind of math that we're talking about here at the cognitive level relates to the math of neurons. I just did that as a really interesting open question. That's probably a more interesting discussion to have later on in the week, after you've seen, or later on in the summer school through next week, or even the week after. But it's never too early to start asking these questions. Okay, so and another way to put version of that question is, how can you implement the kind of things we're talking about here in neural networks, or what would that even mean? Okay, so we've gone through the introduction, cognition. Basic cognition is Bayesian inference, finding structure in the world with non-parametric Bayes. Here I'm going to talk about learning to learn with hierarchical Bayes. But again, sort of the hierarchical Bayes and non-parametric Bayes go very naturally together. They both have to do with ways of building hypothesis spaces, not just wiring them in, and building them in flexible ways that are in response to your previous experience in related problems or aspects of some domain. So think of this as just sort of an additional set of applications, and maybe at the end I have some slides on the same kind of stuff that Sam talked about with sort of grammars for taking this idea of grammars for structure, and I'll maybe say a few other things about those topics. Okay, so let's go back to this problem that we presented in the morning. Again, related to many of the things Sam talked about, learning a concept from examples. How are you able to do this? How are you able to take a few examples and figure out which other things are in the concept from those? Well, it must be because you somehow have already built up from some other experience the right kinds of hypothesis spaces, right? There's no way, and there's no free lunch, right? There's no way to like, if you're getting an infinite concept from just a few examples, there must be a lot of other stuff that fills in the gap. Some of which is based on the other objects that you can see here, I would say, and in some sense, in a kind of sort of semi-supervised or unsupervised structure-finding way, all these other objects here help you to see what kinds of things are out there in the world, right? But also your ability to correctly find the right kind of structure in this much larger array depends on your general knowledge of objects. So another way to put it is, if I had just shown you these things, and I said, what do you think a tufa is? You'd know a lot less than if I did what I'm doing here, which is showing you this whole world, and then giving you a couple labeled examples. There's a lot you can extract just from that whole world, this sort of fancy kind of clustering. But your ability to do that depends on even more general abstract knowledge about visual objects.
So the way we've modeled this kind of thing is to say, well, really you have to start off with this big unsupervised bag of objects, which you're able to cluster in some way. The way we did it was sort of a more of a hierarchical picture like this, where we said, basically by looking at the relevant features of these objects, you can group them into small groups and then group the groups into something like a hierarchy, something like, you can think of this as like an intuitive version of an evolutionary tree, where these objects get organized into these big branches and then substructures there. And then imagine that each node in this tree is a possible hypothesis for what the word tufa could mean. So maybe it labels this branch or this branch or this branch or that branch, right? Remember the Osterweil and Griffith stuff that you talked about, or Kanini and Griffith stuff, which where people were learning a sort of a simpler three-level artificial tree-structured taxonomy with one-syllable names for each of these categories. So this is sort of a similar kind of idea on a bigger scale. And then the idea is, all right, if you're given a few examples that are over there in that part of the tree, then the possible hypothesis, and you said this is a tufa, this is a tufa, that's a tufa. Well then, what could the word tufa mean? Well, maybe it refers to this branch, maybe this branch, maybe this branch. I mean, already you've kind of actually narrowed things down a lot, because out of all the possible subsets of these objects, you're now only considering the subsets corresponding to branches in this tree. And given these examples here, well, you're sort of ruling out branches which are smaller than, that don't span the examples, kind of like in that predicting the future thing, right, where you rule out all the hypotheses of values of t total that are less than t, and then what you're left with are the sort of branches that are bigger than the example set. There's only a few of those, and you're able to pretty quickly figure out, well, probably, or pretty confidently figure out it's probably this one here, because otherwise it would be sort of a suspicious coincidence to get the first three tufas, say, all the way clustered in this branch here. If, say, tufas referred to this really big branch up here, even this much bigger one here, then it'd be kind of a coincidence to get the first three tufas over here if the set of tufas was this much larger set, right? Kind of like with the coin flipping, right? Where, well, you could get, 5 heads in a row flipping a pair of coin, but it's a bit of a coincidence, right? So it's that sense of suspicious coincidence interacting with the right structure hypothesis phase, which we think explains your ability here to get this concept from just a few examples. And there might be a little bit of uncertainty. Remember this one over here, people weren't quite sure. Maybe that's a tufa, maybe it's not. Probably not, but there's a little bit of uncertainty. And in general, for these ones in here, you get a little bit of residual uncertainty that you don't get for these ones over here or over here, which if you remember from our first demo, that was kind of how it worked. Okay, so I'm not going through any of the math of how we've built these kinds of Bayesian models of word learning, but that's sort of the basic idea. What I want to focus on here is, again, kind of following on the themes that Sam was covering, how do you build up this thing in the first place? How do you know how to build this tree? So there's at least two kinds of things you need to know. One is you need to know, in a sense, sort of what features to pay attention to, what counts as similar, right? There's a sense in which I think we'd all agree these things over here are more similar to each other than they are to these things, or these things. And these things over here are more similar to each other than they are to these things. But how do we describe that knowledge, right? How do you learn, part of learning learning to learn the word tufa means learning what counts as similar about objects in general so that you can build up trees like this from the right experience. And then the other thing is maybe like, how do you learn that you should have a tree at all? That was more like the stuff that Charles Kemp was working on. So I'll talk a little bit about that after I talk about learning, the aspect of learning to learn in terms of like what features to pay attention to, what counts as similar. Okay. Also, in keeping with our thrust one of this research program, I want to provide a concrete developmental angle, because these aspects of learning to learn are actually really important in children's word learning. Some of my favorite developmental psychology is this work of Linda Smith and colleagues, which I'll talk a little bit about here, and it helped to motivate a lot of this work that we did on hierarchical Bayesian models for learning to learn. Okay, so here's an example of a neat little thing you can do with your favorite 2-year-old. You can show them a new object like this, and you say, this is a DAX. And now you can show them a few other objects like this, and say, can you show me which one of these is a DAX? Okay, so notice here you have an object that matches this one in its shape, but not in its, say, material properties. Here you've got one which matches in its material properties, but not in its shape. And here you've got one which doesn't match in either of those. Okay. So if you show this to a 2-year-old, which one do you think they'll pick as the DAX? How many people say this one in the middle? How many people say this one? How many people say this one? Yes. Presumably you'd do the same thing. Okay. Yes. So 2-year-olds show what was called the shape bias. It's not a bad bias. It's probably a good bias. They preferentially generalize a new word to other things of the same shape, but differing in, say, material properties, rather than to something which matches in material but not the same shape. Sensible thing to do. A lot of words for categories are organized this way. In vision, shape analysis has always been sort of at the center of things for object detection or whatever, object categorization. Many of children's first words refer to objects which are organized in this way. But it's interesting that it's not like your brain comes pre-wired necessarily to do this, at least in the context of word learning. If you take a 20-month-old, so 2-year-olds are 24-month-olds, but if you take someone who's a year and a half, so they don't show the same shape bias in this task. In this task would be typically at chance, so they would be as likely to pick this one as to pick that one. Yeah.
And does it matter that you have this object in the center that is U-shaped? It's very similar to the one with the right texture, so that you would be
I don't think it matters
together or something.
It's a good question, but I don't think it matters much. I'm not sure. By other measures, even younger infants are already more interested in object shape than material properties. So just to be clear, it's not like they can't perceive shape or be interested in it, but it's something specifically about knowledge about how a new word what kinds of features a new word is going to map onto. Okay. So there's at least some evidence that this bias is learned. Now, of course, just because something develops, and you'll hear a lot more about developmental psychology over next week. Just because something develops doesn't mean that it's actually learned. It could be just like a lot of things mature in the brain. A lot of things are happening between 20 months and 24 months. Maybe just your brain, something's changing in the wiring of your brain that isn't really something you'd want to describe as learning, or maybe you're just sort of, I don't know. Who knows what's going on. But there's actually really interesting evidence that this is learned, and learned in a way that's specific to learning about language and learning about how words are used in language to label objects. And that comes from, this is sort of much older work that Linda Smith did together with Barbara Landau and others back in the 80s. But in some more recent work that's about 10 years old, Smith and colleagues actually did some very interesting kind of training studies to really get at how this kind of knowledge is learned. So you can take a 17-month-old, someone who's significantly younger than the 20-month-olds who are not passing the shape bias test here. So they're again going to be a chance here. And bring them into the lab and give them experience of this sort. There's 4 pairs of objects. Each pair has the same shape but differs in size, material, color, other possibly relevant properties. And the 17-month-olds come into the lab and they're taught a new label for these interesting new shaped things, like this one's a wib, this is a wib, and we might take out these toys and play with them, and the experimenter will say, oh, here's a wib, and here's my wib, and let's play with our wibs. Can you put your wib on top of my wib? And do that for a few minutes. Then bring out these ones and say, oh, okay, here's a lug for you, and here's a lug for me. Let's play with our lugs. And here's a zup for you, and so on. So they just play in a kind of fairly natural way, using the words to refer to these 2 objects in each pair. And they do this for a few minutes, and then they do this again a week later, and again a week after that. And they do this for maybe 6 weeks or 8 weeks, each time for about 20 minutes a week, and each time with the same 4 pairs of objects. So kids have some systematic experience over a couple of months with pairs of objects that are given the same name for based on shape. But it's not a whole lot of experience in the sense that there's really only these same 4 pairs of objects each time. And somehow from this, after 8 weeks of training, and I think it also works with just 6 weeks, now the 19-month-olds who've been through this experiment now have acquired the shape bias. So how do you know that? Well, first of all, if you show them other shaped wibs, they will call them wibs, other of these square arches. So they will generalize these words to yet other looking objects with the same shape. But also you can give them another thing here. So you can give them this task, and now they will pass this task. So this is what's called the second-order generalization. A first-order generalization is generalizing wib to other similarly shaped arch-like objects. But a second-order one would now be generalizing a totally novel, which they never heard before, with a totally novel shape to other things that have the same totally novel shape. Right? We'll get that? Yeah.
What happens if you do this training study, but you, instead of common shapes, you use material properties?
I will come to that. So re-ask that question in 1 minute, or 2 minutes. Sorry. Okay. So this is pretty cool that this works. And that also experimentally, the second-order generalization is basically as strong as the first-order generalization. So they do this quite reliably, just as reliably for DAX, this new thing, as for WIB that they've had this experience on. So it seems like they've learned something generalizable about how to map words onto new object categories. But the most interesting generalization is outside of the lab. So here's data on the same kids' English vocabulary. So these are real words in English and their real meanings. And what they did was they took the kids at the beginning, 17 and 19 months, and they used standard measures of kids' vocabulary, which at this age you basically ask parents from a big checklist, which of these words does your kids know? It's pretty noisy data, but it's, there's some reliability to it, and this has been validated in a lot of ways over the years in developmental studies. And there's a very good control group here, so though the error bars are rather big, the effect is quite convincing, has been replicated. Here's the basic effect, that if you take the kids who've gone through this training over 2 months, from 17 to 19 months, they start off knowing about 15 words. I mean, so again, in case probably most of you don't have kids, a 17-month-old hardly knows any words, really. They're just beginning to learn words in an explicitly recognizable way with their parents. So they know on average about 15 or 20 object names. But after they've gone through this experiment, 2 months later, they know on average 60 names. So they really more than tripled their vocabulary. But the interesting thing is now compare it with a control group who had exactly the same experience, played with exactly the same toys, but just didn't get the words. So they would have the same toys and somebody would say, oh, here's yours, here's mine, let's play with them. Oh, that's cool, let's do that for a while. And now here's this, here's yours, let's play with these other ones. Here's yours, here's mine, let's play with them. So the same 4 pairs of objects on the same experience, but without the words used to label the things of the same shape. And what they did after 2 months is they'd only learned about 30 words. So there's a factor of 3 difference in terms of the number of object names that the kids learned, those who had learned the shape bias. And also, those kids who were in the control group didn't learn the shape bias also for the artificial objects and the artificial words. It's also, importantly, an effect which is specific to object naming. It's not like these kids were just generally better at language acquisition or had learned something just generally about how to, what words mean. Because if you look at all the other words that kids know, they also learn more over those 2 months, but there's no difference at all between the 2 conditions. So it's a really striking effect. So somebody was raising their hand back there? Really striking effect. I don't know of very many studies that show anything like this kind of transfer from learning something in the lab to learning something in the real world, and particularly something that's really quite important for real-world cognitive development as early vocabulary growth. Yeah, question?
How do you explain all of the 24 months being 20 not having it and 24 months having it, even though there's a whole range of parenting styles, which might include something like this? Some parents might do if this is only 20 minutes a week. Yeah.
Well, right. So first of all, when you say that 24 months have it and 20-month-olds don't, that's not a super precise thing. That's of course going to be sensitive to what culture you're in, what language you're speaking. So that's only true for kids who grow up with English as their first language in a particular kind of social economic status group that is a typical laboratory population. For kids, it's interesting that for kids who learn different languages, I think that there are effects that are definitely going to be driven by what language you're learning. So languages which don't have as many frequent early words for concrete object naming don't show a later developing shape bias, and it's much weaker. And I think in general, the kind of I don't know if it's that parenting style, but the environment that kids grow up in, the exact precise timing of language milestones are going to vary as a function of that. So there are going to be error bars on that for any individual demographically defined group, as well as significant variation across. The key thing is that in a typical experimental population, the one that this study was done in, that data is relevant for this study. And this study has been replicated a bunch of times. I don't know how cross-culturally this kind of thing is done, but at least the claim, which I think is well supported, is that it's something like this mechanism, the experience of learning the first words and kind of bootstrapping off of what is generalizable across the first initial object names, namely, they all seem to refer to some different component of the dimension of shape, or not all of them, but that's a statistical tendency, that is what's driving the change in this group, at least in the normal version of this population, from 20 to 24 months.
Couldn't it be the case that the kids have this, and it's not learned, that the kids have an innate bias for shape, and that somehow it's triggered by, typically kids when they're 24 years old, the parents sort of trigger that sort of behavior. How come?
Yes, that is quite possible. So again, when we say that it's learned, we don't, we're not saying that, we're not saying here that they've learned to see shape and somehow before they didn't. Linda Smith has actually made some claims, which I'm not sure how to interpret, that learning words, the same process here, actually changes how you perceive shape. I'm not going to talk about that here. I think there's probably something right about that and other parts which I'm just not so sure about. But yeah, I think this is totally consistent with, and the models I'm going to present, actually I'll show you almost 3 different models of this, which vary in terms of, what one version basically says you're already perceiving shape, and you're just kind of, in a sense, learning that that's the thing that counts for this.
No. I have 2 18-month-old kids, right? Yeah. They definitely know shape.
You can do it within family control.
As soon as I get home, I'm going to start, giving them these things. But what I'm saying is the bias
kid is never going to forgive.
Bias to associate shape with word learning.
Yeah.
That could also be innate. And it's triggered artificially in the experiment, right? So it's just triggering of the innate bias towards the word learning.
Well, right. So I think a lot of that is probably likely to be true in that, again, there's work on other infant work, which I think we'll talk about more next week, showing that, even 10-month-olds are, there's a bias to sort of track object shape beyond, say, object color in infants who are younger than 1 year already, right? And to sort of, in some ways, associate that with nameable object properties. So yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons to think there's kind of, when it comes to naming classes of objects, that there's at least a much more early developed, if not necessarily innate bias to be interested in shape. I think many people would say, if the people who argue for innate biases would say it's not so much about shape as like function or essence, and shape is just a kind of observed cue, so it's possible that what's learned is that shape is a good cue to object function, or something. There's many different ways to interpret this, and here I don't want to weigh in on that. But I think that's perfectly consistent. This is also a good point to mention the thing that Sam asked me about. So Sam said, what if you do the same experiment with, what did you say? With material properties. Yeah. So they did that. Smith and colleagues did that. And what they found is, first of all, that it was a bit harder to train them. So they didn't learn it as well. And that's consistent with the idea that there's some kind of innate bias towards shape as the basis for object categories. The other thing is that it actually had a negative effect on their real world vocabulary. They actually learned fewer. It wasn't, you can see the error bars are big, it wasn't a significant effect, but it was negative. And so they stopped. It's one of those things like, oh, we just thought we were doing a fun experiment, but we're actually messing these kids up. So they stopped, and they then brought them in for a follow-up study. This was never published. I only heard about this from Linda Smith. I think it wasn't. They then brought them in for a follow-up study to check that, like, after, 6 months or a year, they had their head kind of covered, and it almost had. So it worked okay. But anyway, but that's consistent with the same idea that, yes, there's probably some, at least in pre-existing, at this age, pre-existing tendency to associate object category names with shape, but that whatever you're learning in this experiment is really, it is the driver of the real world, much more generalizable inductive biases.
So has anyone done analyses to ask whether the statistics of shape versus material properties are actually predictive of
Yes.
reference?
Yes, and again, that depends on the language. And yeah, Larissa Samuelson, who was one of the co-authors on some of these studies, did some analysis of that and showed, yes, that varies by language by language. Different languages just sometimes just label different things, or preferentially more often, and that predicts also the different ages at which kids acquire and the strength of the shape biases that they have. Yeah. So it's very interesting stuff. I mean, if you want to talk about how real learning works, real human concept learning, I think the single most important thing that's different from the standard machine learning view is that real-world concept learning happens very quickly. You just need a couple of examples of a concept. But even more important is the learning to learn, right? That the inductive biases that allow you to learn a new concept from so few examples themselves can be acquired from just a few examples of a few example concepts, as this study happened to, right? So it's not just that you learn to learn, but you learn to learn from just a few examples of a few concepts, and then you generalize that to this whole broad set of object concepts. So that's very interesting to try to understand how that kind of thing can work. There are in the real world of objects and stuff in the world and language, of course, not all things are solid object, functional artifacts, and not all words are common nouns that label those things. And kids do wind up learning a little bit later other kinds of inductive biases. So, for example, for these non-solid substances like toothpaste or honey or Jell-O and so on, kids by around age 3, I think, acquire a sort of material preference for nouns which label these things. So, like here, if you say, "Oh, that's some tufa," then kids would think, like 3-year-olds would think, "Oh, tufa is any kind of green toothpastey goo like that, or whatever," as opposed to anything that just happens to come out in that shape, right? Like, here you have a bunch of things which all have the same shape. They also have the same material properties. So if we called them Jell-O, that would be fine. But you can show that kids are not, again, not generalizing that for non-solid substances and nouns that label those, they have a material properties. These things also get bootstrapped off of count, mass, syntax, and nouns, and I'm not really going to go into that. But that's also very interesting, right? Like in languages like English, not all languages have this, but the difference between nouns like whatever, tube, where you can say, there's the tube, there's one tube, 2 tubes, 3 tubes, there's more tubes, you have that plural and you count them, versus, there's some, you don't say there's 1 goop or 2 goops or 3 goops or 3 toothpastes or 4 toothpastes, or if you say there's 3 toothpastes, what you mean are there's 3 tubes of toothpaste. So these kinds of inductive biases also interact with learning the syntax of noun phrases in a very interesting way. Here's one other cool thing, which is you take these things here. We can just do a little bit of a demo here. So let's say this is a blicket. So which of these do you think is a blicket? How many people say this is a blicket? How many people say this is a blicket? Okay, so most people go with the thing that's a different color but same shape. You show the shape bias. But suppose I do this. You see what happened? It's a little low. Can you see what happened? Okay. So for those of you who can see, now if this is a blicket, how many people say this is a blicket? How many people say this is a blicket? Right, so your preference changed. What happened? I just added these 2 little dots that kind of look like eyes, right? And again, this is work that Smith and Landau and others showed much earlier, that if you perceive this as an animate creature, right, then its shape isn't as important, or at least it's not a rigid shape. This thing looks like it could be a plausible non-rigid transformation of the same body, and things that are, creatures are likely to change their shape, say in this way, more than they are to change their color and texture in this way. Okay. So this is, again, a really important thing in cognitive development, is learning these flexible and kind of domain-specific inductive biases. All right, so how can we do this? Well, here's a way that we try to use hierarchical Bayesian models to do this, and I'm just going to show you a very simple one. This is also helpful because this is also be one of the models that is on the church prob mods thing that you can look at, and there's been a lot. In some sense, this is also just sort of a tutorial on a very basic hierarchical Bayesian model. It's called the Dirichlet multinomial model. And Charles Kemp and Amy Kerfors, who were 2 students in our group a few years ago, realized that pretty basic hierarchical Bayesian model could be used to at least qualitatively describe some of the kinds of things that you're seeing here. And then I'll show you how that worked. And then I'll show you some interesting work that people in our group did later, taking this and building this out to actually build useful computer vision systems based on this idea that actually improve how they learn object categories in a more sort of real-world computer vision context by building on this sort of idea. Okay. So here's an even more simple abstract game that will help you see how this kind of learning to learn works. Let's say we have a bunch of bags here, bags of marbles, and we draw one marble out of this bag, it comes out blue. So what do you think if I draw another marble out of that bag, what do you think it's going to be? Blue? I mean, if you had to say, or blue, how confident are you? Raise your hand where this is totally confident it's going to be blue, and this is like, I have no idea. Okay, again, you're giving me your sort of medium things. Okay. All right, what if you've drawn from these bags and you saw these things? Okay, so now how confident are you that the next one here is going to be blue? Okay, yeah, everybody's getting good exercise. All right, right. Yeah, so assuming that these bags in some sense are all the same kind of bag, then it does seem like the property of color is distributed kind of homogeneously in these bags. So you could say that that's the same kind of inference. So let's see how we can capture this in a simple hierarchical Bayesian model, and then talk a little about how this could be used to model the acquisition of the shape bags. So here's the model, and I'm drawing this in this graphical format. What we're doing is we're capturing knowledge at different levels of abstraction, which capture or with the corresponding parameters. So at the bottom level, we've got the data that's observed, and each of these branches here is one of the bags. At the bottom level, we've got the draws of marbles. At one level up, what we're calling these thetas, those are parameters which describe the composition of each bag, so the relative distribution of colors inside the bag. And in asserting that you can generalize something abstract across these bags, we're saying, well, there's some kind of distribution on distributions up here with parameters alpha, beta that can be seen as generating the distributions inside each bag that can be seen as generating particular observation, right? And then there's maybe even some hyperparameter on these things. But the idea in this hierarchical Bayesian model is to observe data at this level and make inferences at these two levels simultaneously, right? Now, the math behind this is technically we say, well, these are multinomial distributions, and this is a Dirichlet distribution. A multinomial distribution, again, right, is just a multidimensional generalization of a binomial distribution in the same way that binomial distribution might describe the counts of coin flips. This describes something like the counts of rolling a weighted die, right? So you can think of each of these thetas as like the weights of a die, where one face of the die it corresponds to each color. And if you want to say, well, what's the distribution on colors I would draw from a bag? Well, I'm just talking about like each draw is an independent roll of that die, and I'm interested in to characterize what the bag is like in general. I'm interested in talking about the weights on each colored face. And then, so that's a multinomial. And then here we're saying, well, what's a natural prior on multinomials? Well, this is what's called the Dirichlet distribution, and it's if you're familiar with the idea of conjugate priors in Bayesian statistics, it's the conjugate prior for a multinomial. It has a very similar form, as we'll see, in the sense that you can think of the Dirichlet as specifying like a typical, prototypical multinomial. That's what this beta vector will capture, and then you can think of it also as capturing sort of a strength or variance, like how much each of these individual draws, multinomial draws from the Dirichlet looks like the prototype versus just sort of being far. So just to put some pictures on it that are just schematic, each of the multinomials can be, I'm just drawing it as a kind of a histogram showing the weight on the different colors. So if you've got a bag that's, if you draw a bunch of red marbles from the bag, your guess here is that it's basically a red bag. So that all the weight pretty much is on the red outcome. For this one, if you draw a bunch of yellow marbles, all the weight is on the yellow outcome. Okay. And if you make the inference from this one blue draw over here that it's probably blue, although you maybe aren't quite as sure as in these cases, then your guess is that the multinomial describing this new bag has most of its weight on the blue outcome, but maybe there's some possibility with the others. What licenses that strong inference from just one example is what you've learned up here, this shared prior that seems to describe what's going on in each of these bags, is to say, well, the way this is captured here is we're saying, so that this data basically characterizes what's the distribution of colors across the whole population, and the alpha characterizes how much we expect each individual bag to look like that. So across the whole population, we see all the different colors in sort of roughly equal proportions, not as much blue, so that one's a little bit lower, but the others are pretty uniform. And having this alpha, which is much less than 1, basically says, I think that each individual bag doesn't look very much like this. So that if an individual bag, if I've seen a bunch of red things, it probably just looks like that. Another way to think of alpha is to say, in estimating the bag proportions, how much do you weight the data, the kind of bottom-up signal, versus the shared prior? And if alpha is much less than 1, you're basically saying, go with the data. If alpha is much greater than 1, you're saying, go with this. If alpha is much greater than 1, you're saying you expect each individual bag to look a lot like this. So in particular, consider a case like this. Here what I've done, consider the difference between these. So the difference between these two is, if you look at the bottom, all I've done is take the same marbles and shuffle them around, so that here, in the first one, they were nicely sorted color by bag, and now I shuffled them around so it looks, so, we've got, first bag has 2 red, 2 yellow, a green, and a brown. Here we've got 3 yellow, brown, red, green. Here we've got 2 brown, 2 green, yellow, red, and so on. Just shuffled the same ones around. If you were to look at bags like this, well, now you'd say, well, I don't know, each bag, first of all the bags look the same, although empirically they're quite different, right? This one has 2 yellow, 1 brown, 2 red, 1 green. This one has 3 yellow, brown, and green. This one has no yellow at all. This one has 1 yellow, 2 green, 2 brown, 1 red. So in some ways, they're quite different. But actually, if you look at them, they all kind of look the same. They all look like bags of M&Ms or something, right? And somehow what we get in a world like this is we think, oh, well, I guess, again, the world as a whole has exactly the same distribution of colors, red, yellow, brown, green, maybe a little blue. But now I get the sense that each individual bag looks a lot like the world as a whole. So beta is the same, but alpha is much higher. Alpha is much greater than 1. And another way of putting that is to say that your best guess at what each individual bag is like should be highly skewed towards what the prior says, the shared prior, relative to each individual weight. There's some little effect of each individual weight, but this is really doing most of the work. And now in this case, if this is what you've learned, if you're doing joint inference at each of these levels, this is the part that you've learned that now carries over to a new case. Well, if this is what you've learned, then you see 1 blue, and you say, well, okay, I'm gonna combine this the data, the likelihood term here, with this learned prior. But since alpha is much greater than 1, the prior is gonna dominate, right? So most of what I think about this bag is driven by expecting it to look like this beta prototype. But there's maybe a little bit of an emphasis on blue. Maybe it's a little more blue than the rest of the population. After all, I did see a blue here where I hadn't seen a blue with these ones. Okay, so that's the basic difference between these two cases. Why is it that in this case you've kind of learned to do one-shot learning, or you've learned to trust that one observation in that new bag very strongly, whereas in this case mostly what you've learned is to kind of ignore that one observation or to really downweight it? Well, it has to do with the fact that in this case you've learned that the population as a whole is not very reflective of what each individual bag looks like, but the statistics of that bag is very diagnostic. So that means, trust the data, go with that one or a few examples, whereas in this case what you've learned is basically ignore the data. This thing is just as variable as anything else in the population. So in some sense, here you've learned to not learn about this property, and here you've learned to learn. Okay, so the model that Kemp et al. Built for the shape bias, the simplest model, basically just follows this structure, but it says that there's multiple dimensions of objects. There's their shape, their material, and so on, their texture. And what you're learning is a different one, or you're learning a sort of a parallel hierarchical Dirichlet multinomial with structure like this, where it's the same structure of bags across different dimensions. Each bag reflects an object, a nameable object category. So it's like the blanket, the gloves, the zag, so on. the draws are the objects that you've seen with that name, but you have a different one of these models for each of the dimensions. And you learn essentially that dimensions of, say, material and color are like this, but shape is like this. So you've learned that shape is something which is distributed homogeneously within bags, but heterogeneously across the whole population. Whereas you learn that, say, material properties, they are heterogeneous in each bag or each object category, the same way they're heterogeneous in the object population as a whole. And thus it's really the shape one that should drive your generalization rather than the material properties. So just to put a few sort of little numbers on that, here are the ideas. We said, okay, you have, to model this case, you have 4 bags corresponding to the 4 named categories. Each of those bags has 2 draws from it. And then we're going to measure a bunch of different dimensions, which are all going to be sort of discrete categories. Just like the colors of marbles, there's a bunch of discrete shape categories. It turns out it doesn't really matter how many there are. There could be 20 or 100 or 1,000, and it kind of works out the same. It could even be an infinite number. It could be non-parametric. It'll come out about the same. But here, so there's a bunch of sort of different possible shape categories, texture, color, so on. And then here what you're seeing is, okay, basically there's a correlation where the 2 things that are in bag 1 have shape value 1, the 2 things that are in bag 2 have shape value 2, the 2 things in bag 3 have shape value 3, but texture and color are sort of arbitrarily varying across bags. And what you learn, again, from this is that shape is this thing where the heterogeneity of different shape values is not reflected in each individual bag. Each bag is much more homogeneous than the population as a whole, whereas for texture and color, you learn that their heterogeneity seems to be actually present in each individual bag, so that now when you go to generalize to a new case, so here now we present these, this is the second order generalization, you now present one example of a new category, a new bag 5, that's like the blue marble, and it has a new shape you've never seen before, and also new texture, new color. So all of these are new values you've never seen before along each of these dimensions. But the model's still able to figure out, to do this second order transfer, to figure out, okay, now if I now have some other things which have the same new shape as this object 5, and but different values, yet still other different values for texture and color, so like texture 10, color 10. Or I have this one that has, say, yet another new shape, shape 6, but it matches this one on, say, the texture property. Well, the model's learning to go with the shape as opposed to the texture match. So that's what you're seeing here. It's preferentially saying, okay, this is a draw from a new bag. This one is likely to be from the same bag, but more likely than these 2. And just like human children, also, the first and second order generalization are almost equally strong. So the model is again, generalizing the shape bias to novel shapes almost as strong as to as shapes that it has some extensive experience with, namely shapes 1 through 4. This is the first version of something we called the blessing of abstraction. You'll see this in a few other examples later on, where when you're learning to learn in one of these hierarchical Bayesian models, often learning at the more abstract level, in this case, the higher level here, because of how it pools information across a bunch of different low-level categories, often learning at the more abstract level can be as strong or stronger than the learning at the more specific levels, which is an interesting feature of abstraction in human cognitive development. Somewhat different maybe than if you're used to some of the kind of deep learning systems. Again, you'll see more of that later on, where you might learn layer by layer. You might think that in that kind of architecture, and it sort of seems to be true, you learn the more low-level concrete features first, and then only with a lot more experience, you learn the more high-level things. Whereas in human learning, often you're learning the most abstract things actually pretty early on. Okay. Any questions about this model so far? Yeah.
Could you explain the prior over the Dirichlet parameters?
I didn't say much about it. It's basically just a we assumed a symmetric. Did we do this? I think we assumed a symmetric Dirichlet, where we assumed a symmetric. So the beta part of Dirichlet distribution can itself be seen as like multinomial, right? It's of the same form as the betas. It's one of these distributions that sums to 1 over the possible observable outcomes. So we assume a Dirichlet on that part of the Dirichlet, just a symmetric one with this is very generic. It's basically uniform. And for the alpha, we assumed an exponential distribution. it's just again a kind of natural, fairly uninformative prior, maximum entropy prior with just some mean value lambda. It doesn't really matter what it says. I mean, another interesting feature of hierarchical Bayesian models, right, is that as you go up in the model, the choices, I mean, it's related, it's sort of the flip side of the blessing of section. The choices you make tend to matter less. Like, you're more detached from the data. The precise values of any parameter don't influence things that much. So, if we had set lambda to be some other value, it'd make a small difference. It wouldn't make that much difference. Was there a question back there? You're just trying to see. But I mean, in principle, there's no reason you couldn't also do inference at that level. I mean, you can keep doing inference at multiple levels. You don't have to stop at 2. It's just it's going to matter less. There's going to be less constraint up there to say anything.
That holds for varying the type of distribution.
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly if you assume, instead of an exponential is one that just gives reasonably significant mass across a range of alpha of 1s is just convenient. You could, but if you had a delta function on alpha is 5, you're not going to limit it. I mean, so yeah, you could have had a very strong prior. The typical thing people are doing at least in Bayesian statistics and in a lot of hierarchical Bayesian models, is just sort of making weaker priors as you go up. But you could have had a very strong prior, and then that would very much commit you to something. But particularly if you're going to do as we did here, which is fix that lambda, so not do inference on that, then it's good to have a fairly broad prior. All right. So people have used these hierarchical Bayesian models to capture a lot of different kinds of learning-to-learn effects. Instead of talking about the different kinds of cognitive applications, again, in the spirit of the summer school, I want to talk a little bit about how these ideas were used going back into a sort of more machine learning, computer vision context. This is some work that we did in our group with Russ Solokudinov. Oh, the names are sort of down there in small font, unfortunately. But so you might know Solokudinov as his official first name is Ruslan. He was a PhD student with Jeff Hinton, did some of the earlier Hinton deep learning stuff. He's mostly known for doing deep Boltz machines and various other kinds of restricted Boltz machines and stacked up such things. And Russ is now a professor at Toronto in computer science. But he spent a couple of years at MIT working with me and with Antonio Torralba and doing several projects. But a lot of what he was trying to do was to sort of combine or explore the interface between this more kind of hierarchical, non-parametric Bayesian worldview and the deep learning. This is a project that doesn't use any deep learning. Since I've done a pretty good job of using up most of the time. I had allotted. I probably will. I have a couple of slides after this one on something that combines this with deep learning, which I probably won't go into. But if you're interested in that, I'll at least put it up there so it's point. But what Russ was really trying to do in these projects was to try to see, can we take these insights about how humans learn to do one-shot learning and build better computer vision systems, recognizing that the typical way that object detection systems are trained has a number of limitations, some of which I think the deeper ones, which this work doesn't address, are the representations, right? There's nothing here about three-dimensional objects. All the things that I said we need if we want to do that bicycle rider problem or those graduation hat problems, none of these systems are going to solve that. But they're going to try to get beyond the problem of having to get hundreds or thousands of training examples to try to tackle to tackle the one-shot learning problem, which again is one that a lot of people in the center have been interested in. Tommy, you guys probably didn't talk about one-shot learning yet, right? But you probably will next week in Thrust 5. Yeah. So you'll see different takes on this problem of, in a sense, learning to do one-shot learning or getting the learning curve from the asymptotics of as n goes to infinity to the kind of more interesting case of n goes to 1. This is a problem that a bunch of us are interested in. And I think this is a nice project to talk about because it's sort of really somewhere in between the kind of things that we've done on the more cognitive level. It's very human, child-inspired. But the actual representation it uses is very much of a kind of, it's not learned, but it's a kind of hierarchical, visual system-inspired feature set. So here's the features are what's called the texture of textures. The precise details aren't that important. I think if you took, for example, the features in some of the models that Tommy's group has built, like HMAX type models, I think you'd have similar kinds of things could be done with those. These are the kind of features that were developed originally by Paul Viola and others to build actually the first face detection systems, the first practically used face detection systems. But they're very similar to things that people in Tommy's group had earlier done, using support vector machines and so on for face detection. But basically what these features are doing is they take a sort of basic set of V1 type filters, like looking for edges and bars, filter images with these, pass that through a nonlinearity, and then run that recursively several times. So you're looking for kind of edges of edges or textures of textures, 3 levels deep, and that's done parallel in RGB channels. So there's like basically 15,000, when you take these simple edge detectors and sort of center surround and corner type detectors, and you nest them 3 levels deep in a nonlinear hierarchy, and then you have, it gets you about 15,000 of these features, and then you do that 3 color channels, you get about 45,000 features. But again, these days, this work was done a few years ago. These days, there's no reason to stop at 3 levels. You could do all sorts of multiple levels of pooling and linear and nonlinearities and so on. Okay. The main thing is you build up a high-dimensional sort of neural-like feature space in which you can now take any image, project it into that feature space, and ask questions like this. So, for example, let's say you didn't know anything about cows, but I showed you this one image here of a cow, and I said, look through your big database of images and show me other things that are like this one, right? It's kind of like a computer vision version of word learning. If I say, this is a cow, can you show me other things that you think are cows? And what we'd like is our system to return things like this. Most of these are cows, but maybe they're all cows. Maybe that's a sheep or something. This is not what we'd like it to do. It returns a sheep, a cow, a couple of chimneys, and an open field. Now, the thing here is that if you just take this high-dimensional feature space and find the nearest neighbors to this one image, then this is actually what you get. The nearest neighbor is a sheep, the next nearest neighbor is another cow, but then you've got these chimneys. What you'd like is to get something more like this. Oops. And the system that Russ built learns to do this because basically what it learns to do is to reshape the similarity metric in this high-dimensional space to capture more what defines the object categories of interest. That's similar in a sense, but in a much more high-dimensional setting, to learning that shape is what counts for some kind of categories, but learning that, say, material or some other properties count for other. So it's learning a similarity metric, but it's learning a category-specific metric. The features that you want to generalize for cows are rather different for the ones that you want to generalize for say, cars or trucks, or knives or forks, as we'll see in a second. So it's not just that you want to take this 45,000 dimensional feature space and weight some of the dimensions differently, but you want to learn that some dimensions should be weighted high for some categories, but other dimensions should be weighted high for other categories. Different categories should have not only different prototypes, but different similarity metrics. And the real challenge of one-shot learning is not just learning, what the cows, what does the typical cow look like from seeing one example? But if different categories have different similarity metrics, how are you going to learn what counts as similar when you only have one example? Or to put it in the way we do here is we're using a kind of high-dimensional Gaussian representation of each category. So if you have, let's say you have, you have one cow like this, and you have the sense that the similarity metric can be captured by some kind of covariance structure. How can you learn a covariance matrix from one example? I mean, it's hard enough to guess the mean of a Gaussian, a high-dimensional Gaussian from one example, but it seems like you should have zero information about the covariance structure. But the insight behind this is that it's sort of summed up in this slogan here that similar categories have similar similarity metrics. Or you might say categories whose means are close by are also likely to have similar covariance matrices. So it's a picture like this. Let's say that you've seen a bunch of dogs, horses, and sheep, but only one cow. But you might say, well, in this part of your high-dimensional feature space, it seems like the labeled categories tend to be elongated in the X direction, but not the Y direction, right? Or if you like, so the similarity metrics being close in this vertical Y direction is very important for whether you're a dog, horse, or sheep. It's very discriminating. Whereas this dimension, the Y or horizontal one, is not very discriminating. As opposed to this other part of the space, where we've got our cars, vans, and trucks, and over here it's different. Here, your X position is very discriminating of whether you're car, van, or truck, whereas your y position is not so discriminating. So what you'd like to essentially learn is sort of that each of these categories now can be described by some high-dimensional Gaussian, well, where high is 2 in this picture, but is actually 45,000 dimensional. But you want to learn that in this part of the space, the Gaussians are sort of generated by one sort of uber Gaussian that's elongated in one space, one direction, and over here they're elongated in different directions. That's kind of like learning that, for some kinds of categories, say the solid objects, it's shape that matters, whereas for other kinds of categories, it's the material properties that matter, like for the non-solid substances. And the way that's captured in this model is by learning, here's just another example of, given this cow, you get other cows and sheep, and whereas here you get some sheep and some park benches. Okay, so this is not what you want, but that's what you get in the original space, and this is what you get with the learned metric. So the way that's captured is, again, this is a model which combines a few of the elements that Sam was talking about. It's learning a hierarchical model on object categories where at the basic level, or sort of most immediately nameable categories like cow, horse, and sheep, and truck and car, and so on, are these high-dimensional Gaussians. So it's learning means and variances for each of 45,000 dimensions at this level. But it's also learning priors on those things, which are sort of, it uses a kind of normal inverse gamma parameterization of the prior of these things. It's not really that important, but it basically looks kind of like the way the Dirichlet prior multinomial looks a lot like the multinomial, but just has sort of a strength parameter. It's the same idea, but for Gaussians. So that you can think of it as like saying, as like in this picture here, where the prior on each individual low-level Gaussian is itself a kind of a higher, broader Gaussian. And if you get one example of a cow and it's kind of close to this very general Gaussian over here, then that gives you information that the covariance of cow is like the covariance of the more specific categories that also are generated by that same node. So that's basically like you see your one cow and you infer, well, I don't know what this cow is, but it seems to be a kind of an animal. So basically you're inferring actually that cows should be attached to this part of the hierarchy, as opposed to say figuring out or seeing this cow and think, or seeing this thing and saying, I don't know what that is, but it seems to be a kind of a vehicle. So the key part of the inference here to do this one-shot learning is actually forming this hierarchy. The hierarchy is itself learned. Nothing is labeled animal or vehicle, but that's actually learned by taking labeled examples of cow, horse, sheep, truck, and car, and then assembling them into this tree that sort of groups the classes into these superclasses according to which classes seem to be generated from the same prior. And you're able to build out this tree even from one new example. It's using this, I think Sam talked about this, you talked about the nested CRP, is that right? So it's using that nested Chinese restaurant process where the generative model, the prior on trees, has a Chinese restaurant process at each level. So this tree could be infinitely broad at any one level, but the way the CRP works is it wants to concentrate as possible the categories into a relatively small number of branches, each branching off of a relatively small number of branches at the level above. So just to show this applied here to a couple of cases, that, in this paper we applied this to a data set of 25 or so categories from a Microsoft research data set. This was a nice one to use because the particular named categories they had seemed to intuitively cluster into some natural superclasses. And you can see this is the recovered hierarchy that the model finds. So, for example, it has a branch that puts forks, knives, and spoons together. It doesn't know anything about forks, knives, and spoons other than those are just three arbitrary labels for three categories, but they seem to have the same kinds of features in common. It puts cows and sheep together. It puts trees, birds, flowers, leaves together. Now that's a little funny. Trees, flowers, and leaves maybe should go together. And you might say, well, why should you put birds in there? But at least in the grand scheme of things here, again, because it doesn't know anything about living things, it's not so crazy that there's features shared in common. It puts buildings, chimneys, doors, office scenes, windows together. It puts airplanes, benches, bicycles, cars, different views of cars together. Again, like it might be a little weird to put benches and chairs in with bicycles and cars, but maybe not so weird as far as sort of visual, high-level similarity. It makes sense. Puts clouds over here in their own category. Again, it's not saying that that necessarily, benches are particularly similar to airplanes, or that trees, flowers, and leaves are particularly similar, but it's saying the ways in which trees are similar to each other are similar to the ways in which leaves are similar to each other. The ways in which forks are similar to each other are similar to the ways in which knives are similar to each other. Yeah?
So, it looks like in some real world things, like an airplane could be described as a machine, but also as a flying thing, kind of like a bird, and sea could be described as an island or as a country. So, is your model restricted to hierarchies? That is where.
Well, this model is, but remember the thing that Sam talked about, which was the crosshat model. That was designed to tackle that sort of problem, right? To sort of recognize that there might be multiple ways of categorizing the same domain of objects. And you could do that. You could imagine making a cross-nested CRP thing, right? It's one of the nice things about this toolkit is that it's very compositional, right? Like you can take the base. I mean, Sam gave various other examples of taking this set of building blocks and combining them. So that would be an interesting extension that you could do. Just the last basic result to see here is that this is an ROC curve for classification. How many people are familiar with ROC curves? Okay. How many people are not familiar? Okay. So most people are. If you're not, it's basically a way of measuring the efficiency of a classifier where you trade off, depending on how you set the threshold, when you have a graded signal, where you trade off the different kinds of errors, misses and false alarms, detecting something when it's not there and failing to detect it when it is there. And the sort of ideal perfect performance would be an ROC curve that's fully up here in this upper left-hand corner. And here what we're doing is we're comparing the efficiencies of 3 different classifiers, none of which are all that great here, because in this wasn't designed to optimize performance on object detection. We're using these 45,000 feature dimensions. They're okay. They're not necessarily the best thing to do. You could, and in later work by Russ and others, we've applied the same kind of idea to fancier kinds of representations. But anyway, the main point here is to study the learning to learn effect. So what you've got here is that the black curve is the best possible performance you could do with an infinite number of examples using this representation, which you have this 45,000 dimensional feature space, and also you represent each category just as a multidimensional Gaussian. That's itself pretty restrictive. And this is the best you can do with all the examples that you have. The red curve is what you get when you just do Euclidean distance in the original feature space. So no learning to learn, you're just doing nearest neighbor similarity. And chance performance for an ROC curve is just this diagonal line. And you can see that Euclidean distance is barely above chance. It is above chance, right? I mean, when I showed you these examples of Euclidean distance given a sheep, it's not like there's more sheep than are there by chance, right? But it's barely above chance. The blue curve is what you get when you've done this learned metric. So you've basically we're doing kind of held out cross-validation where we hold out a category and we learn this hierarchy of categories and the relevant inductive biases for all but that category, and then we see now how well can we do with just one example of the new category. And what you can see is with just one example, once you've done this learning to learn in the hierarchy, you can do almost as well as the ideal thing, as the best you can do. And it's just a very simple but nice illustration of how you can learn to do one-shot learning, or by learning these inductive biases in this hierarchical non-parametric model, you can shift your learning curve such that almost all of the work is done now for a new class by the first example. Question?
Well, maybe this is more for discussion, so I could wait.
Yeah, I was just going to show one other thing you can do with this is now you could also hold out some of these categories, and actually you can sort of learn to do unsupervised learning. So suppose we hadn't seen any chimneys, trees, or clouds in our training set. And now we see a bunch of new things, which include examples of things we've seen before, like cars and bicycles and forks and benches, but we also see a few trees, chimneys, and clouds. This is like going back to the problem that Sam started with. Like when you see a rhinoceros, is that like some weird unicorn or is that some new species? Like this fundamental problem of trying to figure out, okay, is this a weird example of a thing I've seen before, or an example of a fundamentally new thing that I haven't seen, even if it's not been labeled for you? Well, this system is able to do that. So it's able to decide that each of these things is one example of a category it already knows. And whereas these ones here, it's able to figure out, hey, these three are first of all, that they're all in the same category, and that it's of the same kind as the birds, flowers, leaves, and so on. And it's able to say, okay, these are all in the same category. I don't know what they're called, but they're of the same kind as buildings, doors, and windows, and office and urban scenes. and these things are all of the same kind, and they're not of the same kind as anything. So it's able to figure out that clouds are a whole new branch at the highest level, which is kind of cool, because it's true. They're not really like any other object in this database. Okay, yeah, did you want to now raise your discussion?
It occurred to me that it seems related in some way to these ideas that originated with Roger Shepard on second-order isomorphism. And so there's ubiquitous finding in psychophysics that people are often much better at comparing things than making absolute judgments. And one idea is that when we represent the similarity between two things like cows and dogs, we're not, if you ask them to judge similarity, they're not necessarily, this was sort of Shepard's idea that you're not judging the similarity between their sort of prototypes in the sort of context of this model, but rather their similarity metrics in some sense. You're comparing the similarity between similarities. That's the second order isomorphism. And this idea was revived. I'm curious what Tommy thinks, because I believe this is related to stuff that Shimon Edelman did with Tommy a few decades ago. And this idea that there was this argument that the brain doesn't really have this veridical representation of the world, but represents these similarities between similarities.
I think it's really related to stuff that you're probably going to talk about next week, right? The templates are the way to achieve invariance by basically getting examples of several other invariant categories and then sort of projecting other. You're going to talk about that next week, right? So why don't we come back to that question? Okay. But I think it'd be interesting when you talk about that, or we can all talk about it together. Yeah, I think Tommy's recently developed some approaches which are sort of Edelman-like, kind of like, it reminds me of that chorus or prototype or something, right? It's like some of the stuff that Shimon Edelman did, but now trying to achieve invariance in a sort of neurally plausible architecture that I think they have a whole rich mathematical theory for, which is different from this one, but it's true. It's very interesting to ask how they might play.
This is a whole set of approximations or learning techniques, like, for instance, radial basis function, where you have a set of examples and you express a new input in terms of the distance to each of these example functions of
Right, but the kind of model is kind of capturing the idea of similarities between similarities.
Right, because this is part of what you're doing here is you're learning about variance and invariance, right? You have to learn that, okay, even though I've never seen these things before, that it seems that there's some dimension that characterizes the abstract similarity of this category, such that I can figure out, hey, these should go together, and these should go together, and these should go together, even though I have, in this case, no labeled input at all. So, anyway, something to come back to. Other questions about this? All right. I'm going to skip through. There were a few other slides on this so-called hierarchical deep model, which does more, basically, it learns a similar hierarchical non-parametric Bayesian model of the classes and superclasses, but it also integrates that with learning features at the lower level. And if you're interested, you could check out these papers by Palikudinov on that. And just to, let me just see where we are in terms of time. Well,
You can do it at 4, continue at 4.
Yeah, well, I guess it is our plan to continue at 4, but I'll just talk for maybe 10 more minutes, and then we'll take a 15-minute break. Is that reasonable? Okay. So again, just to echo some of the themes that Sam raised, and to set up where we're going for the last part, it's great to say we want to capture learning to learn with hierarchical Bayesian models, but if we want to learn the most interesting kinds of abstract knowledge, that at the high levels of the hierarchy, we need things that I think go beyond the statistician's toolkit, right? That are not just Dirichlet's on top of Dirichlet's and exponentials on top of those, but rather capture something that really looks like more structural knowledge. So Sam mentioned this work that Charles Kemp and I did where we were trying to understand, in a sense, just to put a little bit more of the kind of cognitive motivation behind this. A lot of the most interesting discoveries of knowledge are ones that refer to the form of a model, right? Like when, in biological thought, when people went from thinking about animals as organized according to something like the great chain of being in medieval Europe to something more like a hierarchical tree structure in Linnaeus, or Darwin's more sort of randomly branched evolutionary tree. Well before anybody understood the mechanisms of natural selection or selection more generally or whatever evolution that might give rise to the tree structure of species, people were able to, just by looking around at the natural world and being somewhat scientific about it, decide that there was something like a multi-level hierarchical structure? Or how did Mendeleev figure out the periodic structure of the elements? He didn't understand quantum mechanics, the reason why the periodic table has the form it did, but just by looking at the observable properties and sort of thinking creatively about the right kind, sort of topology of similarity, he was able to come up with some initial version of the periodic table. And children are making these kinds of structural inferences too. So this idea that category labels should be organized into a tree, well, that, just like the shape bias, that's also something which kids don't come initially really thinking about. I mean, they might be biased towards a tree as opposed to some other periodic forms, for example. But initially, when kids are learning labels, they have what's called a mutual exclusivity bias, basically. Like, they think each thing is one kind of thing. If you've learned one name for something, then that's it. As opposed to, like, the phenomena of hierarchical classification, where something could be a dog, it could be a mammal, it could be an animal, it could be a living thing, just like, we had in these models before. So kids have to kind of learn that category labels can be hierarchically organized like that. But our standard structure learning algorithms, even the nice ones in the standard hierarchical non-parametric toolkit or many other similar things in earlier eras of data analysis, they're all assuming the form of the structure. So, if we can go in with a clustering algorithm or a mixture model, and it can be a non-parametric mixture model. We can be learning how many clusters there are, how many mixture components, but we've assumed we're looking for clusters. Or if we go in, with a tree-structured nested CRP, we might be able to learn, the number of levels or the branching factor at each level, but we're fixed to looking at trees. So Charles's approach here was to say, well, let's define these grammars, which are simple rules for growing out graphs, basically, where the idea is that graph is a universal language for many different kinds of structure, and then these graph grammars are languages to capture the more abstract forms of structure, like the difference between a set of flat clusters and a chain, or a chain and a ring, or a hierarchy, or other kinds of things. And by taking cross products of these rules, you're able to get things like more interesting kinds of multidimensional structures, like to describe a two-dimensional space as a cross product of a chain and a chain, or a cylinder as a cross product of a chain and a ring. And then what it means to do hierarchical Bayesian inference here, and this is just putting a little bit more, most of the mathematical details are still hidden away here, but a little bit more of the hierarchical picture behind what Sam was talking about, is to say, okay, well, let's say we've got some data here, which is like one of these data matrices, a set of observations on, remember the data he showed with the animals and their properties, like the alligators, the ants, and so on, and they're having whatever their properties were, boats and beaks and hunting and so on. Like, you can just say any data matrix of objects and attributes, and what we're trying to do here, could be the objects, and the rows of this matrix could be the images I showed you before, and the columns could be those 45,000 dimensional features, or they could be units in a deep network, whatever you like. The idea is to say, well, let's see if we can take this data set very generally and make inferences at these two different levels. The level of the structure, which might be, say, a particular tree-structured hierarchy, or it might be some low-dimensional space, whatever. And then also at this level, which are the rules which grow out the structure, which generate this. So this is a rule which generates only hierarchically tree-structured graphs with the objects at the leaf nodes. And here's a cross product of two rules, each for growing a chain, which you put them together in that cross product, and you get rules that grows out two-dimensional grids. And the idea is that we can define a probabilistic model, first a prior on these rules, and then each of these can be seen as defining a distribution on graphs, again, kind of restricting our hypothesis space, but also biasing us towards simpler graphs of the appropriate form. And then each of these graphs puts a distribution on these objects here, which, again, to keep with this combinatorial toolkit theme, is actually a Gaussian process. So the way you link this level and this level is to say, basically, you assume that the features of objects are a distribution over these graph structures, and you assume that, the intuition is that objects which are closer in the graph should have similar correlated feature values. And the way you get that is by basically turning the graph into the kernel of a Gaussian process, so that it's now capturing this notion of sort of smoothness based on closeness in the graph. More technically, it's using the idea of the graph Laplacian to provide the inverse of the Gaussian process covariance function, but basically the intuition is just that. It's that closeness in the graph is now capturing correlation in feature values. So in that sense, it's a really cool way to take, on the one hand, what's sort of now become a pretty standard, powerful Bayesian machine learning toolkit of something like, graph-based covariances for Gaussian processes, but then to add this extra level of what looks like more sort of traditional AI symbolic knowledge representation grammars for graphs that is able to capture the knowledge at this high level and to do joint inference at these multiple levels to figure out, as Sam was saying, that, for a data set of animals, something like a tree structure is the right way to capture what's going on, whereas for some other domains, like here we took the voting, this is the same kind of data matrix, but now the rows are, instead of being animals, are Supreme Court judges, and the columns, instead of being biological properties, are now how they voted on different cases. And here, you could logically represent this as a tree, but in fact, what comes out to be the best structure is this one-dimensional chain, a kind of a left-right spectrum, where, again, we can recognize the judges over here on the left as the liberal ones like Arshall and Blackman and so on, and here you've got the more conservative ones like Scalia and Thomas and so on. And what the system is figuring out is that not only is it recovering this sort of liberal conservative underlying factor as the best simple model of how people vote, better or worse, but that kind of one-dimensional model is the best abstract form of structure to make sense of this data. Okay. And again, Sam already went through these examples. Like here, this is an example of taking faces, recovering the sort of two-dimensional structure of a kind of a white-black sort of racial dimension, and there's sort of a masculinity dimension here. It's a little harder to see the masculinity dimension, but you can think of it as like these are the sort of football players and these are the tennis players or something. If you look at it like that, and or whatever. Anyway, but again, we generated these images by turning these knobs on a face synthesis program, and then we just gave this algorithm those high-dimensional data vectors just corresponding to the pixel images, and it's able to figure out that there's that two-dimensional grid structure and recover what the dimensions are. Okay, or here it's recovering the latitude and longitude of cities. I'll just make one more point about this model because it just links back to some of the other hierarchical Bayesian themes that we've seen, which is, remember this phrase, the blessing of abstraction, this idea that knowledge at a higher level of abstraction sometimes can be quite easier than you might think to learn, maybe even some ways learnable before much of the knowledge at lower levels of abstraction. So a version of that here is to say, look at a kind of a developmental learning curve where we take this animal data set, which has about 100 features in it, and we present progressive amounts of the data. So to start off, we just present 5 randomly selected features of animals. It's about 5% of the data, and then 20%, and then 100%. And what you see is when you give this model only a small fraction of the things you could observe about animals, it learns a much simpler representation. It learns this flat clustering, basically. It doesn't learn a tree structure. In a sense, it follows what in kids you would call mutual exclusivity. It puts everything in exactly one category. So you've got a category of insects and birds and I don't know what this is, a sort of fish together with amphibians, and here you've got a category of like carnivorous mammals and non-carnivorous mammals. Those are sensible high-level categories. Then you give it a little bit more data, you give it 20% of the data, and now it's made a kind of a phase transition, right, or a sort of a paradigm shift. Now it's got the idea of a tree. Suddenly it's linked all these things together. It doesn't have the right tree, and if you look at it, you can see it says a lot of funny things compared to the adult tree. So it puts penguins in with dolphins, seals, and whales, whereas when you've given it all 100% of the data, penguins are over here by the birds, and the whales, dolphins, seals are over in their own subtree. What else does it do? It hasn't made a bunch of differentiation, so it hasn't differentiated the flying from the flightless insects, or the flying from the flightless birds, or some other things like that. So it's less well articulated and doesn't have quite the right structure. In a sense, it takes a lot more data to work all the details of the tree and to get the smaller scale branches right? But it gets the big picture first, right? Like Darwin and even Linnaeus, right? They got the idea of the tree before they understood the details and why it is the way it is. And that idea of kind of getting the big picture first in some kind of sort of aha-like insight, that's again a kind of distinctive human kind of discovery phenomena that we'd like our models to be able to capture. So just to kind of summarize that up then, since we should stop to have time for the coffee break and the tutorial, I was going to show a parallel example of this in sort of a causal learning setting, but I won't go into that. If you're interested, this would be kind of cool. We can talk about it later. another example of sort of learning high-level causal knowledge with this blessing of abstraction. But let's see, I guess I was optimistic about how much slides. Let me just skip through this. We'll do this church stuff later, and a lot of this developmental stuff later. But I just want to make a comment about some of the things that Sam mentioned, because the last thing I was going to show was just again, some of the things he showed at the end was this work by Roger Gross and various people, including me, but also Russ Lipidinov and Bill Freeman were big parts of this, where we were taking this idea of, sort of high-level symbolic descriptions of knowledge in a hierarchical Bayesian framework and trying to see what you could do with this now, again, in a machine learning setting. And I share Sam's appreciation for this. Though I'm an author on these papers, I have played a very distant role, particularly on the really cool stuff that James Lloyd and David Huvineau did, that thing at the end that Sam showed with the machine that writes its own, the algorithm that writes its own papers. But I want to say that, again, just part of the point of this was to take, I don't think that any of this model or the other stuff with the Gaussian processes and the grammar of those Gaussian process kernels, I don't think those are particularly good models of anything that goes on in the human brain that what humans do. But I think they are examples of trying to automate some aspects of scientific data analysis using some insights from what we've learned from computational cognitive science, that we can capture high-level discoveries that humans might make from data with this kind of toolkit of hierarchical Bayesian models with more structured, symbolic, kind of grammar-like representations of the high-level knowledge. I guess the one thing I would want to say a little bit differently from what Sam did, which is just, I appreciate the idea of how you put it, of automating, replacing scientists with algorithms or something, or how did you put it? I mean, we do talk about this stuff in terms of automating statistics, but I think it's really important to say that automating some aspects of statistical data analysis, like the choice of the model form. This is these are two other data sets. So Sam showed an example of kind of solar flare data. These are examples of this this Gaussian process covariance stuff where this is an example of taking a kind of airline traffic volume or atmospheric CO2 levels. And it's really pretty cool that you can give this system, in this case, kind of a time series of how airline traffic volume has increased over the years. But not only that, it has the seasonal variation, and the seasonal variation itself increased over the years. So this is like monthly data for airline traffic volume, a series of months over the 50s and 60s. And you can actually get this thing to sort of extrapolate this function, both extrapolating the general upward trend as well as recognizing this complex kind of periodicity and the fact that the periodicity itself is expanding. That's all pretty cool. And you do this by, again, this sort of kernel for composing, or this grammar for composing the kernels of Gaussian processes to give a very rich set of possible functions, and even one that can, as Sam said, write its own report. So this is a few pages of one of these reports, and the whole thing is kind of automatically generated. But it doesn't replace a scientist for a bunch of reasons. One is that the way the report is generated is there's a lot of, it's not any sophisticated natural language processing. I wouldn't say it's necessarily badly written, but it's written from a very stock template. A lot of scientific papers are also written from a stock template, so maybe that is kind of like automating science. But again, I want to emphasize how much more there is to science than just data analysis. We all know, all of us are working scientists pretty much, right? We all do data analysis, as part of our jobs. But there's much, much more to science that goes beyond just, not just fitting the parameters of the model or even choosing the form of the model, but thinking about what questions to ask, or what questions are even worth interesting, what phenomena are worth exploring, how would you design a good experiment, what would even count as relevant data for some question that's interesting to you, how do you integrate what you've learned in one experiment with all the rest of what you know. That none of these algorithms are trying to get at, but it's important for our thrust of this research program, because one of the things we'll see this next week when we get Laura Schultz in here and talk about children's learning is that there's sort of a long tradition of studying children's learning as like a kind of intuitive science. Many things that children do when they learn about the world sort of looks like scientific activities, but it goes way beyond data analysis. And in a sense, the toolkit that we've been able to algorithmize so far are, more and more of the parts of science that are the data analysis part. But the really interesting challenge, and it's one that people are just starting to make progress on, but it's really mostly open, is how do you capture, in a sense, the aspects of learning which are like science, but go beyond data analysis? And that's still the really interesting open question. And I'll just say, leave that till next week. Okay. So thanks for your attention here, and we'll now let's take a 10-minute break, say, and come back at 4. And there we'll start learning about probabilistic programs, which are sort of a powerful unifying language for many of these kinds of models. Tomer will present on that, and we'll also do some sort of interactive tutorial play. So make sure you have your laptop. If you haven't installed WebChurch, try to do that. If not,